Cool. All right. Yeah, so welcome to the last session of the day. I'm sure everyone is exhausted and of the conference. I promise to keep it around 40 minutes instead of 60 so that you guys can rush out because I know you're exhausted. So yeah, with that said, my name is Leslie Cordero and welcome to my talk on how to cultivate psychological safety in the context of site reliability management. So before I continue on, I'll begin by saying that, while this talk is centered around reliability management, it is generalizable to many other contexts. We'll talk about incident management, which, put another way, is a form of crisis management, sustainable organizations, and leadership in general. So just a little bit of background on me. I'm currently a staff engineer on the operations engineering team at the New York Times. And within that, I focus on making all apps across New York Times observable. And so over the course of my career, I've been on many engineering teams, and each of these teams was unique in its own way, right? Each team had its own way of doing things and its own unique set of problems. And, but in spite of all this complexity of each of these teams, two things always seem to remain true. And the first is that teams always perform better when they feel psychologically safe. I'm sure this isn't surprising, right? Psychological safety is something we actually talk about a lot now these days, especially since the pandemic. But what I really want to emphasize here, though, is that psychological safety is particularly important for reliability management because of the nature of the work. Every engineer has at least one story of a time they took down production or deleted some database, and the reason we remember these stories so vividly is because they were stressful at the time, right? Especially if we were less junior or less senior. Incident management is stressful. It's a vulnerable time for our systems, but also for ourselves, right? We're more prone to mistakes during times of stress, and we fear the consequences of mistakes that often aren't our individual fault. Whether it's personal consequences of a culture that lacks a blameless culture, or of knowing the impact that comes every time your application experiences unreliability. And obviously, I'm not talking about my experience working in EdTech or one of the major news companies. And so this is why reliability-focused teams need to be particularly thoughtful about building a psychologically safe environment. And so I'll spend the rest of our time reviewing the principles and practices I've found to be effective for reliability-focused teams. But before I do that, let me take a step back and talk about how I came to develop my style of leadership. So I mentioned briefly that I'm a staff engineer and previously was in EdTech, but before that, I did computational research focused on the education sector. I worked as an analyst at a nonprofit for education and spent hundreds of hours of my time tutoring, mentoring, and tutoring students. In other words, right, I've been thinking about education my entire career. And one of the reasons for that is because I've always been obsessed with this idea that education should be a place where students can learn and feel empowered. And so many years ago, I encountered this idea of trauma-informed education, or trauma-informed thinking, which is basically a methodology that considers how trauma impacts learning and behavior in the classroom. And so this approach resonated deeply as someone who is a woman of color in the United States, where we face the daily trauma of racist patriarchy, frankly. And also as someone who's purposeful about working on teams that don't look like the cast of Silicon Valley. And so when I think about building psychologically safe teams, I come from an approach influenced by the principles of trauma-informed education. Now, trauma-informed education actually has 7 core principles, but I'm going to focus on the 3 that influence my approach to building teams most. So first, we have that psychological safety is created by building trust through respect, acceptance, and transparency. And so what this means practically is that we can build trust by making the expectations of our team and culture clear. There's an uneasiness that comes with ambiguity, especially during times of crisis. And this uneasiness can be distracting, right? It makes us more vulnerable to mistakes that can have social and technical consequences. And so we can strive for standard practices while making it clear that mistakes and failure are an inevitable consequence of engineering and of being people. Simultaneously, right, we must show respect for another by preparing for the fact that standard practices aren't always going to be sufficient for everyone's needs, and that we need to have a healthy balance of standardization and flexibility to accommodate the diverse attributes of our teams and our systems. And so by driving this clarity, right, we can show both the respect and acceptance that is required for understanding and then therefore trust. Secondly, the importance of empowerment, voice, and choice. We don't build trust within a team and assume we have it forever, right? Just like in other relationships, right, trust needs to be maintained continuously and renewed every single day. And so a winning strategy for that is to continuously empower folks to raise the challenges and issues because they can trust that they'll be addressed or even feel empowered to address them themselves. And so we'll talk about this more later, right? But engineering is all about feedback loops. And so building feedback loops that incorporate the voices of the members of your team is crucial for maintaining trust and empowering your engineers. And so lastly, we have inclusion. The psychological safety of everyone on the team needs to be a top priority. And harm and bias should never be tolerated. We build our culture with the most vulnerable people in mind first, because when we build for the most vulnerable people in mind, we're way more likely to build for everyone in mind. And so tech has historically been ineffective at prioritizing the experiences of marginalized or vulnerable people and also our vulnerable selves, regardless of identity. And so we must adapt our way of building culture and teams so that those of us who have historically been excluded, whether that's as a woman or even as a parent, which many of us are, so we must adapt our way of building cultures and teams, right, so that we are actually safe, supported, and embraced. All right, so far we've talked about the importance of psychological safety and some of the principles behind that. But I mentioned earlier, right, that there are two things that always remain true for every team I've worked on. And the second is that chronic problems are the most common threat to psychological safety. So what I mean by this is that chronic problems threaten psychological safety by eating away at your team's ability to be resilient to change and, more importantly, failure. And the longer chronic problems go unaddressed, right, the more you risk burning out even some of the strongest teams. And so what do I actually mean when I say chronic issue, right? It's kind of an ambiguous phrase, so let's characterize it further together. So I define two main characteristics that distinguish chronic issues. The first is that these issues are repetitive or long-lasting, right? You can think of a team or community that you're part of, and if you've been on that team or community long enough, you can probably pretty quickly identify some of the issues that you all see continuously and over again. And obviously the severity of these issues does vary widely, but each poses some risk to your culture. At worst, right, they are those services or tools that break so painfully often that your on-call folks are constantly having to debug production issues. And at best, maybe they're those flaky end-to-end tests that you keep ignoring because they pass on retry, but in the back of your mind, you probably know you should look into them. And the second is that these problems tend to be very difficult to solve. And so this is usually why they become chronic in the first place, but this is also part of why they're so important to solve, because chronic issues are some of the biggest indicators of organizational dysfunction. And so reliability teams deal with chronic issues all the time. It's almost always our bread and butter, right? Whether that's in the form of recurring monitors that frequently need to be actioned or toil. So now let's tie all of this back to our principles for earlier, right? How do chronic issues impact our ability to hold true to the principles that we went through earlier? And so starting with trust, acceptance, and transparency. When something is around for so long that you can depend on it to basically happen again, and it's something that we consider an issue collectively, that probably means some shared value or principle is being violated. Maybe it's on the more simpler side, like your code base is being chronically under-tested, and that being some sort of indicator that we aren't meeting our org's definition of production-ready code. Or maybe it's something more severe, like that person who keeps saying things that they shouldn't, despite everyone claiming that we care about diversity and inclusivity. These situations make people lose trust in your team's ability to hold truth to your values and its ability to handle any kind of conflict. Secondly, chronic issues directly impact a team's sense of empowerment. Again, when an issue is allowed to go on for so long, and especially without action, right, people are left feeling unheard and like they're unable to do anything about the situation they're in. And this kind of acquired hopelessness is never healthy. We need some source of flexibility that enables teams to prioritize issues that they deem important to improving how they work, whether that's through feedback loops with important stakeholders or making time for teams to express some creative freedom. And so lastly, chronic issues are also inclusion issues because chronic issues are felt by the most vulnerable people first. And so this is a point I think that's easily lost, and so I'm going to repeat it in a slightly different way, which is the flaws of an organization are always felt by the most vulnerable people first. And so I'll elaborate by talking about a personal example where I felt this in the context of how our teams work. So I have a seizure disorder that's sometimes pretty disruptive to my life. And so prior to the pandemic, right, work from home wasn't nearly as common and sometimes just not allowed altogether. And even when my workplace was accommodating to my needs, it didn't save me from the feelings of exclusion I began to feel, right? In an environment where I was already set apart because of who I am, it was just another way to make me feel like I didn't belong. And this was a pretty common experience for disabled folks, right? We spent years advocating for accommodating workplace only to be told that it could never work. And then suddenly see that we make this shift in March 2020. And so, imagine reconciling the relief that we could finally be accommodated with the anger that things could have been this way all along. And so we advocated for the benefits of remote work, which is ultimately, again, that amount of flexibility that it provides to serve our individual needs and lives. And the consequence of chronically ignoring the needs of disabled people was that a lot of companies and employees really struggled to transition to working remotely during a time where our literal lives were at stake. And so had we listened to those coworkers so long ago, we could have all been reaping the benefits of remote work for much longer than the last 3 years. And instead, we not only lost the opportunity of what could have been all these years, but we also lost people along the way. And so sitting with that consequence, right, for a second, right, people literally lost their lives because we didn't transition to remote work quickly enough. Disabled people, able-bodied people, it impacted all of us, and I'm sure we can all think of an example. And this is just one example, right, when everyone could have benefited from building our workplace with our most vulnerable employees in mind first. And there's a version of this type of issue that exists for every vulnerable or marginalized community of our field. And so, furthermore, bias is a chronic issue itself, right? We have not solved all the ableism and racism, et cetera. Even the healthiest cultures, right, have bias embedded in them. And so when I asked you all to think of a chronic issue earlier, if you couldn't come up with one, then bias is the first one that you can start with, because I guarantee that this is an issue for someone. All right, so I define 3 approaches to handling chronic issues. The first is preventative, the second is proactive, and the last, which is the one we want to avoid as much as possible, is reactive. And so the preventative approach requires you to design processes and systems, both technical and social, that prevent these problems in the first place. This ties back to what I mentioned about striking that right balance between standardization and flexibility earlier. And by using our collective context, right, to inform how we strike the balance, we can design systems and processes that age and scale well. We won't be able to prevent all of our problems this way, but it can reduce the number of problems and keep our teams focused on harder problems that will mature our teams. And so to do that, we have to have a way of monitoring the health of our team or organization. And so these are the feedback loops and contexts I've mentioned, and they can take many different forms, but the point is that we should make it easy to find patterns that serve as input for short-term and long-term improvements. Again, by making these feedback loops robust. Feedback loops ultimately serve the function of communicating context and pain points through the team, which is important, right, for ensuring that people feel heard. And so I started off this talk by saying understanding risk and planning for these failure modes or chronic issues is a tenet of creating psychological safety. Because problems will arise, right? It's inevitable. But the upfront investment that we put into building robust feedback loops can drive our teams towards being in a preventative or proactive state instead of one that is reactive. So I'm going to ground this in an example because I'm focusing a lot on theoretics. And so one robust source of feedback is on-call, which if you've ever been on an engineering team with on-call, everyone has an opinion on it. And the experience on-call is a great feedback loop, right, for improving the way that our technology and our teams work, right? Because ultimately we can learn something from every alert, every page, every on-call task. And so all of this, it can be really powerful data used to improve the quality of our systems, both, again, technical and social-wise. Next, you should be strategic about how your team prevents chronic issues from happening in the first place. Again, going back to our feedback loops, we should be constantly learning from these feedback loops, right? Over time, building our team's collective knowledge of how to manage reliability effectively and build excellent software. Which is why I tend to lean more heavily on the design and production readiness phases of engineering. Now, we have to balance this, again, with being able to ship quickly, right? That's a lot of the pressures that we feel, especially if you're on product engineering. And so I think when people hear this, they think I like to run my team slowly. But I've always found the opposite to actually be true, right? Investing early and continuously allows us to not be constantly distracted by systems that are best defined by their inability to be reliable, right? And the most successful projects I've seen that were delivered on time were ones where a lot of thought was put into the technical design and production readiness parts of building software. Because ultimately they led to development being a lot smoother and built confidence for when it ultimately was released. Now, when you're not in this mode, it can be really hard to get here. Often it involves years. And that's because it ultimately involves a degree of trust, that the time that you invest more upfront will pay off later. And so when I introduced this way of engineering on a previous team, I heard a lot of initial pushback from my cross-functional peers who were concerned with the productivity levels of the team. So for folks who are on teams that feel like rushing is causing a lot of your production issues, choose one project to try this out on, and when it goes well, use this as a model for getting buy-in and driving long-term change. Now, this long-term approach has to be complemented with a short-term approach for when that long-term approach inevitably falls through from time to time, which is why having a strategy for holding your teams accountable to itself is important. And so these strategies or frameworks, right, should be transparent and they should align with our core principles. Decision-making ultimately shouldn't be happening in just a silo, right? Your teams should feel like they're part of the process. And so luckily the tech industry has come up with at least one solution to this need, which is service level objectives or error budget policies. Service level objectives, or SLOs, introduce transparency by defining concrete reliability targets. It clarifies our collective expectations around what kind of reliability experience we ultimately want to provide users. Coupled with error budget policies, which define the measures we take when we actually stop meeting those reliability targets, SLOs can introduce an extra layer of accountability that makes teams more resilient to failure. So now let's talk about a very common source of pain for teams, again, on-call. And so, like I mentioned earlier, most folks do not look forward to on-call. I'm sure many people agree with that, right? And again, as I said earlier, incident management can be really stressful, especially if the state of your on-call is best described as utter chaos, which I think is a very common experience. But that shouldn't be the case, right? Ultimately, right, if your engineers are dreading on-call, that's feedback that means that your state of on-call is unhealthy. And incidents and on-call noise aren't the only sources of pain for on-call shifts though, right? It's unfortunately a very common experience for on-call engineers to balance the work of on-call with their long-term project work. And I totally consider this some sort of anti pattern. Not only is it unfair to the engineers, but it introduces instability to your roadmap, right? Especially if you're depending on making progress in the context of a deadline. So because of this, I prefer to avoid this tension altogether by having what I refer to as dedicated on-call shifts. And so what I mean by this is that instead of forcing on-call folks to balance both on-call work and long-term project work, reinforce the empowerment principle by empowering the engineers on call to take ownership over how they spend their time on call outside of direct incident management. Not only does this relieve the stress of needing to manage incidents and project work at the same time, it also communicates a trust in teammates to make on-call better over time by providing that steady avenue of creative freedom for them to solve problems that bother them most. And so before I move on, the reason I don't consider this a long-term approach is because you're not going to be able to rely on only on-call to mitigate your issues. Right? Not every issue or improvement will be able to fit into just one shift on-call, which tends to be a week, maybe two. But it is a powerful way of keeping your team accountable to itself. And it's an additional layer of reassurance. And lastly, it shouldn't be one leader holding a team accountable. Right? By falling into that pattern, we're introducing a huge dependency on that leader to hold our team true to our values and excellent work. And much like a dependency introduces technical system vulnerabilities, so does the concept of a singular leader. And even if our team or organization isn't large, right, we can find ways to reduce our dependency on leaders. Maybe that means making sure our team has strong relationships with other leaders in an organization or even mentors. But ultimately, the goal here is to promote a sustainable leadership model for our team or our organization, one where power is distributed so that leaders can use each other's strengths to serve the shared goal of building excellent, healthy teams. All right, so now we will switch to the proactive state. In the proactive state, right, a potentially chronic problem has already emerged, but it hasn't caused significant problems yet. We don't want them to get any worse, though, so because we proactively monitor for early indicators, we can address issues before they do have long-term impact. I mentioned earlier that the most vulnerable people in an organization are the first ones to feel dysfunction. And so we need to make sure that our feedback loops capture this entire range of perspectives. We need to dig into the granularity of our experiences or behavior because different issues will affect different people and different systems. But that doesn't mean they aren't just as important. This is best served by having multiple sources of feedback loops, with a stern reminder that too much process can also introduce its own set of problems. And more importantly, we should focus on making feedback actionable. That way, when we revisit the processes during times that are designated, to strike that balance of focus and retrospection used to iterate our pain points. And so having worked for companies with tons of bureaucracy, I've seen way too many processes be a source of harm instead. And so we should expect our initial solutions to not work sometimes. And instead of forcing our teams to accommodate the process, we can adjust processes to accommodate the needs of our teams. And so even though we should always be looking for new areas of improvement, it's okay and even essential that we celebrate the progress we do make. We should show gratitude for the ways that our teams do step up, for the times that people show that they care about preserving psychological safety, right? We all probably have some form of a retro, either maybe general team retros or project-specific ones or incident postmortems. And during that time, right, we should make space for explicit celebration during these rituals. Right? We can revisit pre-mortems to see what risks that we identified that ended up not happening. We can make space during incident postmortems to celebrate the things that our teams did do well during what was probably a very stressful time. And lastly, there is the reactive approach. At this point, the chronic issue has already had a negative impact on our team. And now we're kind of forced into addressing it. And once we've reached the state where an issue has become chronic, it becomes a lot more harder to solve. And it becomes a lot harder to restore our team's sense of safety because at this point, our team has probably lost trust in its leaders, the organization in general, and worst case scenario, each other. And so instead of taking this moment as a signal for making change happen, what we often see instead is that organizations come to rely on acts of heroism until people reach the point of burnout. And when I say heroism here and burnout, I'm not just referring to the type of burnout that we tend to focus, which is overworking. I'm also referring to the type of emotional burnout that happens when someone is in an environment that's unhealthy. Whether that's something like constant underappreciation because we're so focused on the work, or something more severe like dealing with bias or harassment. So it goes without saying, heroism and burnout are not effective strategies for organizational failures. Because ultimately, that's what we're asking of people when they're put in that situation, to make up for organizational failures by sacrificing their well-being. All right. So now we're going to expand on the cultural and organizational consequences of heroism some more. And so heroes prevent true progress because they're band-aids to systemic issues. Right? They prevent progress by allowing us to put off the hard work of actually addressing those deeper organizational flaws. Right? And over time, right, they snowball, ultimately. And so kind of like tep debt, which I think we're all familiar with at least somewhat, right? It might be an effective short-term strategy, but it's not an effective long-term strategy for building sustainable organizations. Eventually, we have to pay that back, right? And the way we pay that back tends to be in the form of burnout. And so not only is this awful for the people who have to experience that, right? It's also awful for our organizations and our business. We all know how hard it is to hire and retain people these days, right? We don't want to give them reasons to leave. I will say I wrote that last sentence before layoffs happened, so it might not have aged super well there, but I think the point still stands. And so, if we're in a situation where our only choice is to engage in heroics, right, we should push back and say no if we're in that position too. And if we're not in that position too, or we're still forced into engaging in that kind of behavior, that's good information for whether this is the type of environment we want to be a part of. And so lastly, the impact of heroism isn't distributed equally. It looks different depending on your personhood. For some, it's a point of celebration, but for others, it's merely an extension of what might already be a psychologically unsafe environment. For example, when people with more power present themselves as heroes in the workplace, it's often something that they're celebrated for. But for others, it's merely an expansion of what might already be unfair expectations. Setting the precedent of heroism only furthers unfair expectations placed on certain groups of people. And this is ultimately what is meant when underrepresented people say that they have to work hard, twice as hard to get half the recognition, right? Because who we choose to celebrate is ultimately a reflection of our values that are often coded in biases. And that privilege of choice to participate in this kind of behavior isn't one that's afforded to everyone. And the second part of this third consequence is that heroism often leads to disproportionate power between teammates. I said earlier how we should reduce the team's dependency on themselves, right? But this applies to everyone in the team or organization. Heroism is dangerous because ultimately it redistributes power by putting people in a place where they have to depend on heroes. And this is why having a strong leadership core is so important. When a team or organization becomes so reliant on one person, especially when that person is a leader, it can start to feel like they're untouchable, like they're incapable of being wrong, which everyone is, and also of being held accountable. And so what do we do when we get here? Ultimately, unfortunately, I'm here to deliver some but obvious hard truths. So when a team teaches, I need more water, I'm sorry. When a team reaches this state, leaders are the ones responsible for the organizational failures that got them there. Blameless postmortem culture is a wonderful tool, but it does not always apply to leadership. And in fact, a crucial part of blameless culture is that you shift towards identifying the systemic reasons that cause the problem. And so while blameless postmortem culture might not agree that leaders are at fault for these issues, blameless postmortem culture definitely agrees that leadership is responsible for them. And this is a thing that we see a lot of leaders struggle with more than everything else. It can be really hard to reconcile the fact that most of the problems that we have to solve or work on aren't directly our fault, but that they are our responsibility. And that, ironically, as much as we don't want to cast blame and whatnot, it's when we ignore our responsibility as leaders that things actually start to become our fault. And so this brings us to another truth, which sometimes you, me, or whatever leadership core we're a part of are those leaders, right? And the onus is on us to take that responsibility. And what that responsibility looks like is maybe holding whoever is leadership to us accountable in the ways that we have access to. But it's just as important that we recognize the role that we play in organizational failures, because the higher up in leadership or the more power you have, the more your flaws have the potential to scale across our organizations. And so use whatever access you have to action on that responsibility. Sometimes we have to be strategic about when we use the privilege of leadership, especially for those of us who are underrepresented leaders, but generally speaking, we tend to underestimate and underutilize that privilege in the context of leadership and work, but also in the context of the world generally. Now, so I've thrown the word responsibility around, I've thrown the word responsibility a lot, but given you all no direction on what that actually looks like. And so taking responsibility as a leader is wildly complex, but I try to condense this into 3 steps. The first is to admit where we went wrong, right? Admit that we played a role in letting it get this way, whether our role was direct or one of enablement. The people that we lead will actually appreciate us a lot more for being vulnerable about where we went wrong, especially if we follow up with action. Because psychological safety is about feeling safe to make mistakes, while also trusting that you're in an environment that seeks to minimize psychological harm through accountability. And this is the core of what it means to be trauma-informed. It's not just about feeling unsafe, or it's not just about feeling safe that we as individuals can make mistakes. It's also about preserving safety in spite of the mistakes that will inevitably end up happening. Which is why the second step of taking responsibility is centering the folks impacted. And this is why we need to really practice empathy. Right? Who was harmed in the process? Who had to step up as a leader because we couldn't or didn't? We should thank them, right? Reward them and ask what they need to rebuild trust. And we might not always be able to provide that, what they need. And oftentimes it's too late to rebuild that trust. But at the very least, right, I think everyone deserves to have their experience honored through change and actions. And selfishly, their thoughts and words can be a reminder that the work of leadership isn't about us. It's about the teams that we lead. And lastly, there are the actual changes you follow up with. That means revisiting the preventative and proactive measures that you have in place. We should ask ourselves, where did our processes fail to get us here? What cultural or organizational flaws contributed to the situation? And so tying this back through what we just talked through in the last slide, when centering those who are impacted, ask for their thoughts on these questions without placing the entire burden on them. And the way I have done this in the past is by putting my own thoughts into what changes I thought was impactful. And asking them, what did I miss, right? What's not obvious to me might be very obvious to them. And so asking them for their experiences and feedback can be powerful data to use to improve our organization. And we should always consider the vulnerability that comes with sharing those experiences and thoughts a gift. And we can honor that gift by following up with action. Depending on the situation, what those actions look like can vary widely, but approach it from a socio-technical systems thinking angle. What organizational change can we use to remedy the situation and make sure that it doesn't happen again? And depending on the situation, we might have to make some tough decisions. This is really hard, right? But it's also really crucial because threats to psychological safety or individual people aren't a trade-off that we should make lightly. Leadership is earned, not owed, continuously, because just like the flaws of an organization are felt by our most vulnerable coworkers, so are the flaws of our leaders. So one final note. I know none of this is easy, right? Everything I said is a lot easier said than done. And personally, my hardest times as a team or tech lead or manager were ones where I had to deal with these types of complex issues, whether that was stepping up in light of difficult situations like harassment or bias, or driving serious change to a culture that enables deep burnout. And every single one does take a little bit out of us, but that's the price we pay for the privilege of leadership. And as leaders, we should never lose sight of that privilege. The privilege to cultivate community, to cultivate culture in a way that achieves excellence without sacrificing people along the way. And in a world where sacrificing people in the name of business leads is so unfortunately common, choose to bring this energy, this way of thinking, in all the ways that you have access to. Trust me that as hard or as frankly scary as it might be, having been in the position where my access to that was very minimal, the heartache that comes with privilege, with leadership, is still one of the best privileges I've ever had. And so honor that privilege by being honest with yourself and others about where your organization isn't doing right by people, where you might not even be doing right by people. I mean, and ultimately, right, this is why we attend conferences like this, right? We refine our craft by being exposed to other people with experiences that we can learn from. And so honor your craft as a leader by surrounding yourself around people who you can hold accountable and whom they can, honor your craft as a leader by surrounding yourself around people who can hold you accountable and whom you can do the same for. Leadership can be very lonely, but it doesn't have to be, for our sake and especially for the sake of the people we have the privilege of leading. Thank you. And follow me on Twitter. I'm at CLeslieCode. And I think now we can take some questions. And I told you all I would take about 40 minutes. So any questions? Yeah?
What option would you take in driving leadership change when your leaders don't want to make change themselves?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question was basically what you do in the situation where you want to drive some sort of change and leadership isn't on board with it. Yeah, so I think the way I think about cultural change or organizational change is bottom-up and top-down approach to change. And usually a combination of the two is better. But if you're not in the position that the top-down is possible, right, I think that's when you really emphasize the bottom-up. And ultimately, sometimes it's a block that you can't get past. And when I've been in that situation, truthfully, I have just left. And so when I mentioned earlier about tough decisions, it's those kind of tough decisions, right? I have left organizations, sometimes in maybe not the most clean way. But ultimately, in retrospect, it was those sort of things that actually did end up leaving change. And I didn't experience the benefits of it, to be honest. And I think that was probably one of the hardest moments, one of the hardest parts of it. But yeah, sometimes it's just not possible. And sometimes it takes some form of extremity to make change happen, which is very, very scary and what I was referring to earlier. But ultimately, it becomes a very personal choice of like how much effort you want to put into it. Because when I mentioned like burnout, right, the emotional burnout aspect of it, things like that are what lead to emotional burnout. And so just a TLDR is like, you can emphasize the bottom-up change, right, by having, and this is how revolutions start, is, you top-down change and then bottom-up, preferably at the same time, but sometimes bottom-up is enough. Any other questions? I will be around for a little bit after if you want to ask something more one-on-one. I know this is like a topic that's can be a lot. So, but yeah, if no other questions, thank you for attending, and I hope everyone got something out of it.